Ready for a deep dive today. We're tackling some big assumptions about global conflicts. Can take a long look at the relationship between the West and the Middle East.
Yeah, going beyond the headlines,
Way beyond.
Uncover that historical tapestry, woven with power struggles, cultural clashes, all that, the stuff that's often overlooked.
It's so easy to just think, oh, it's all about religion.
Right.
All boils down to Islam. But
Yeah.
what if I told you a lot of that tension, those fault lines, they were already there
Oh, yeah.
centuries before Islam even came on the scene?
We're going to peel back those layers, right? We'll look at how Christianity's own internal struggles, you've got empires rising and falling and colonialism, all of it playing a part in shaping things.
And speaking of shaping things, got to talk about those global powers.
Yeah.
The U.S. especially, how their actions actually contribute to the very crises they're always claiming to solve.
It's amazing, isn't it?
It's wild.
That tendency to view crises like through this lens of immaculate conception, they just sort of appear out of nowhere.
Yeah, like it's got nothing to do with us.
Right.
But we had no part in this.
Right.
It's like they totally forget they have any role in shaping events.
Right.
Like remember that quote from the senior Bush administration official?
Oh, yeah.
We create our own realities.
Chilling. It is. And it's dangerous to ignore how our actions ripple out, on that global stage.
For sure. Okay, so before we get into those power struggles,
Yeah.
let's talk about Islam's place in the worldly faith,
Okay.
because it didn't just appear out of thin air.
No, it came from, the Middle East was already this crossroads of faiths. Islam shares a heritage with Judaism and Christianity, all stemming from that Abrahamic tradition.
Right, that shared root. But then there's that danger, right, of viewing Islam as like this monolithic, unchanging thing.
Yeah.
It's like saying all Christians are the same,
Right.
which we know.
Of course not.
Not even close. Catholics, Protestants, evangelicals, the whole spectrum.
There are many Islams. Different interpretations, different practices, depending on where you are, the culture, the historical context.
Not like the many Islams. It acknowledges that it's living, breathing, always evolving, always adapting, like any faith.
Exactly. It's more accurate to say that Islam is what Muslims think Islam is, as well as what they want it to be.
Love that. Okay, so let's rewind way back, before Islam even entered the picture, what was already brewing in the Middle East.
Okay, so picture this, right? The Middle East, battleground between two massive empires, the Byzantines and the Romans, centuries before Islam. And it wasn't just political, they represented different cultural and theological views within Christianity itself.
So even within Christianity, there were seeds of conflict, different visions of faith and power.
Absolutely. It went deeper than just doctrines. You had the Latin West, Rome, and the Greek East, Constantinople.
Ah, so language itself became a divider, right?
Yeah, cultural, theological even. And as Rome declined, Constantinople rose, and that shaped how Christianity developed in the East differently than the West.
That Latin versus Greek divide, Constantinople's influence, it's all there before Islam.
And it has a huge impact. Think about it. The New Testament wasn't written in Latin, it was Greek. That cemented Constantinople's authority, defining orthodoxy.
Wow. Okay, so we've got this cauldron of tension brewing, East and West, even within Christianity. And then fast forward to the Crusades, that classic clash of Islam and the West.
Right.
But were they really just about religion? Or was there more going on?
Well, there's the popular image, right? Noble Christian knights fighting the infidels to reclaim the Holy Land.
Yeah, that epic battle.
But the reality, as always, much more complex. The Crusades were driven by, political ambitions, economic interests, social anxieties. Religion was just a convenient rallying cry.
So those epic battles for the Holy Land, they weren't just about reclaiming it from Muslim control.
Think about when Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade. His speeches barely mentioned Islam or Muslims.
Seriously, Muslim or Islam? Those words weren't even there.
Missing.
So he's calling for a war against, what? Anyone who wasn't Christian, a very broad enemy.
Exactly. And even before reaching the Middle East, Crusader bands were targeting Jewish communities in Europe.
They saw this as a chance to purify Europe.
Right, expand their power, and religion was the excuse.
So the Crusades were about projecting power just as much as religion. And was this brutality only for those seen as enemies of the faith?
No, even Eastern Orthodox Christians, fellow Christians, were targets.
I thought they were all on the same side.
Remember that tension between Rome and Constantinople? It made them vulnerable. The sacking of Constantinople in 1204, the Crusaders inflicted horrific violence on their fellow Christians.
So without Islam, they would have found other reasons for conflict and conquest.
It makes you think, doesn't it? And it shows how intertwined religion, especially the Pope's authority, was with political power during the Crusades. The Pope commanded armies, made alliances, dictated war. Very different from the more secular leadership in the early Islamic world.
Even in this supposed clash of civilizations, lines were blurred, motivations were mixed, power dynamics were often hiding behind that religious mask.
Absolutely. And this nuance goes beyond the Crusades. To understand the West's relationship with the Middle East, we have to look at all these forces, from divisions within Christianity to empires rising and falling.
Okay, so moving on from the Crusades, let's look at those internal divisions within Christianity, the Reformation, a time of upheaval and questioning, really fracturing the faith. How did this internal struggle within Christianity affect the relationship between the West and the Middle East?
You know, the Reformation is incredibly important for understanding both Christianity and, surprisingly, Islam. There are these really interesting parallels between what the Reformation did to the Catholic Church and the rise of modern Islamist movements.
Okay, now I'm intrigued. How does a movement within Christianity connect to what was happening in Islam centuries later?
Well, both the Reformation and modern Islamist movements came from this desire to, purify and reclaim their faith. Both involved questioning authority, rejecting established hierarchies, and wanting a more direct personal connection with the divine.
So a shared feeling of discontent, wanting to go back to what's seen as the true faith.
Yeah, and this often involved challenging those in power. Just as reformers like Martin Luther challenged the Pope and the Church, modern Islamists often challenge governments and religious establishments they see as corrupt, un-Islamic.
So it's not just about religious practices, it's about shaking up the power structures.
Exactly. Look at John Calvin. His vision for Geneva was basically a theocracy.
Right.
Religious leaders with political power,
Yeah.
very similar to the idea of an Islamic republic, like in Iran.
Both trying to create societies based on their religious principles.
Exactly. Another interesting parallel is the Anabaptist movement. They emphasized individual empowerment, adult baptism, rejecting the idea of inheriting faith, just because of your family.
And how does that connect to Islam?
A lot of Islamic fundamentalists believe that true faith requires understanding, commitment, not just accepting what you're born into. They think modern Muslim societies have strayed from the true path, just like those who believed in the great apostasy within Christianity.
So both seeing a fallen world, a need to reclaim the faith.
Yeah.
It's about actively choosing, owning it.
Exactly, and both wrestle with how to apply those values to society, to governance. Should religious law be the basis for civil law, balancing individual freedom and moral principles?
Big questions. For centuries, within and between religions, it shows how religion and power are intertwined. It's never just about personal belief.
Never. Now let's look at a concept within Christianity that helps understand some modern Islamist thought: the great apostasy.
Okay, the great apostasy, what's that?
Some groups believe that the Christian church went off track early on, corrupted by the world, power struggles. They see the church's hierarchy, its doctrines, its history even, as a departure from Jesus' teachings.
So rejecting the very institution that claims to represent Christianity, that's a big statement.
It is, and some modern Islamists think the same way about contemporary Muslim societies. They see them as abandoning true Islam, corrupted by the West, by secularism.
So a shared feeling that the world has gone astray, that there needs to be a return, a purification.
Exactly. And this often leads to rejecting those in power, those seen as perpetuating the straying. A desire for radical change, restructuring society based on their interpretation of religious principles.
It's amazing how these movements, separated by so much time and different religions, have such similar motivations and challenges.
It is. It shows that this struggle with faith, with power, searching for meaning, it's a universal human thing.
And those themes, they're not confined to any one place.
Right.
They're part of the human story, part of our history and our present.
Understanding that connection is key to navigating the world.
Let's talk about how Islam has interacted with other cultures. We hear so much about this clash of civilizations, Islam and the West.
Yeah, and that narrative, it comes from fear, misunderstanding. It ignores the nuances. Islam has had all kinds of interactions with other cultures. Conflict, yes, but also coexistence, even fusion.
So that clash of civilizations, it's oversimplifying things.
It is. Samuel Huntington's theory is influential, but cultures aren't static. Those boundaries shift. how communities interact depends on the context.
It's like assuming everyone in a group will act the same way.
Exactly. We have to look at those local dynamics, the specific circumstances. Even within one faith, one culture, beliefs and practices vary.
There's that saying, right? Me against my brother, me and my brother against my cousin, me, my brother, and my cousin against the other clan.
Perfect analogy. Religion, Islam especially, isn't this one force driving conflict? There are so many fault lines. Ethnic, political, economic.
So not Islam versus the rest, but this complex interplay of identities, interests, and history.
Yes. And we see this in Islam's interactions with different cultures.
Yeah.
The Russian Orthodox Church, India, China.
Let's talk about Russia. They have a long history with Islam, both within their borders and in geopolitics. How has that relationship been shaped by their historical tensions with the West?
Russia's relationship with Islam and the West is tied to their sense of self, their historical grievances. After Constantinople fell, Moscow took on the title Third Rome,
Right.
defender of true Christianity.
So there's already tension with the West, a rivalry.
Exactly. And that sense of otherness extended to Islam as well. The Russian Orthodox Church, like the Byzantines, saw Islam as a threat.
So this anti-Western feeling, suspicion of Catholicism and Islam, it became part of being Russian.
Yeah, and it shaped their expansion. Conquering the Kazan Khanate, a Muslim territory, was seen as this holy mission, a crusade.
So religion was used to justify taking land, like the Crusades.
Right. But for Russia, converting people wasn't the main goal. It was about power. Religion was the story they told.
Power dynamics often trump religious motivations, even in those so-called religious conflicts.
And this tension between religious and political motivations is in how they govern their diverse population. They used this system of administering the state through religious communities.
Divide and conquer.
You got it. And can that system really bring harmony and integration? This struggle between religious and ethnic identities within a state, it's a theme throughout history.
Identity is complex, shaped by so many things.
Yeah.
And then it gets even more complex with the rise of nationalism in the 19th century.
Yeah, and people were debating what it meant to be Russian for the Slavic majority and for the Muslim minorities. And this was all happening as Russia itself was struggling with its relationship with the West.
So even the Russians were dealing with West versus the rest, trying to figure out where they fit in.
Exactly. And for Muslims in Russia, it was even more complicated. Were they Muslims first or Russian citizens? Or members of their ethnic group? Where did their loyalties lie?
Tough questions for any minority group.
Definitely. And then the 20th century brought even more upheaval. The revolution, the Soviet Union.
So how did the Soviets, being atheists, deal with the Muslim question?
At first, they didn't know whether to co-opt Islam, crush it, or undermine it. They ended up trying to promote ethnic identity over religious identity.
To weaken Islam's power. Did it work?
Somewhat, but they faced resistance. The Basmachi revolt in Central Asia, driven by nationalism and religion, showed the limits of Soviet control.
So Islam still had power as a rallying force.
Yes, and then their invasion of Afghanistan in '79, they faced fierce resistance from the Mujahideen, fighting a jihad, another example of the power of Islam.
Military might can't just erase faith or the desire for freedom.
It can't. And this complex interplay of Islam, nationalism, and geopolitics, it's still shaping Russia's relationship with the Muslim world today.
It's fascinating how those anxieties about the West, about cultural and religious differences, they keep coming up.
They do. And those anxieties aren't just in Russia. Europe is dealing with a growing Muslim population, anxieties about integration and identity.
Let's talk about Europe. There's been a lot of Muslim immigration in recent decades.
Right. Yeah.
And it's sparked debates about Islam's place in European society.
It definitely has. And it adds new layers of complexity compared to those historical interactions we've talked about.
Yeah.
Unlike Russia, India, or China, where Islam has been interwoven for centuries, Muslims in Europe are mostly recent immigrants.
Coming for economic opportunities, not as conquering armies.
Exactly. And that brings unique challenges for both sides. Muslims coming from different backgrounds have to adapt to a secular Europe where religion isn't as central to public life.
And Europeans are worried about preserving their own identity, their values.
Yeah, you see this in debates about multiculturalism, freedom of speech, what it means to be European.
Europe's going through an identity crisis.
You could say that, and within that, there's this fear of Muslims as a fifth column, undermining European society.
The fear that they're not really loyal?
Exactly. And this fear is fueled by events like 9/11, terrorist attacks involving European Muslims.
A few acts of violence can really taint the perception of an entire community.
It's true. And we have to remember, most Muslims in Europe are peaceable, law-abiding, trying to build lives.
So what are some challenges they face?
Well, there's economic marginalization.
Oh,
A lot of Muslim immigrants, especially from North Africa and the Middle East, struggle with poverty, unemployment, discrimination. It makes it harder to integrate.
so it's not just culture, but structural inequalities.
Exactly. And those inequalities get tangled up with cultural misunderstandings and prejudice.
So it's a two-way street. Both sides need to understand each other.
Exactly. Tariq Ramadan, one of the leading scholars on Islam in Europe, he talks about integration being a two-way street. Muslims have a responsibility to learn the language, the culture, engage with society.
And Europeans need to be open to accepting Muslims as part of their society.
Right. Integration doesn't equal assimilation. It's about coexisting, respecting each other's identities and values.
And that's where it gets tricky, right? Those cultural differences, values, lifestyles can be hard to reconcile.
They are, and those clashes are amplified by anxieties about Islam. You see it in debates about headscarves, halal meat, building mosques.
They become symbols of those anxieties.
Exactly, and those tensions are worse with the rise of right-wing populism. They exploit that fear for votes.
It's a dangerous cycle, fear and prejudice feeding off each other.
It is. And then add the global war on terror, all the suspicion, security concerns, even harder for Muslims to integrate.
So many factors all coming together to make it tough. Socioeconomic inequality, cultural differences, political opportunism, global security.
And in the midst of all that, a new European Muslim identity is forming.
What do you mean?
Second, third-generation Muslims, they feel less connected to their parents' home countries, more connected to their European experience.
Caught between two worlds.
Yes. And it's both a strength and a source of tension. It can lead to a more nuanced view of Islam in a Western context, but also friction with more traditional interpretations.
Identity is always evolving.
Always. And to understand the challenges of integration, to foster a more inclusive Europe, we have to understand that evolution.
Europe's relationship with Islam is complex, full of tension. But there are also stories of resilience, adaptation, even interfaith cooperation.
For sure. One example is the growing number of Muslim students at Catholic schools in France.
Really?
Yeah, there's a shortage of Muslim schools, and some parents think Catholic schools are more supportive of religious expression.
So it's not about converting, it's about finding a place where their kids' faith is respected.
Exactly. It shows that we can find common ground even when it seems impossible.
That's hopeful, you know? Even with all the clash of civilizations talk, there are people working to build bridges, create a more peaceful world. It is heartwarming to see people finding that understanding, right?
Yeah.
Especially when it feels like the headlines are all about clashes. But let's shift gears a bit. Talk about Islam in India.
Okay.
Over 1,000 years of interaction, conflict, coexistence, cultural fusion.
Really challenges those assumptions we have about Islam and other cultures not being compatible.
India's always felt like this incredible mix of cultures and religions, you know? What makes Islam in India so unique?
Well, Islam didn't just enter India through conquest, like we often think. In the South, it spread through trade, missionaries.
So more gradual integration.
Yeah, more organic.
Yeah.
It led to a pretty harmonious coexistence between Muslims and Hindus in the South. They often share ethnicity and language, but in the North, it was different. Islam arrived with those conquests from Central Asia.
Ah, okay, so that's where we see those classic clash narratives.
Yeah. Right. Those conquests led to powerful Muslim dynasties, the Mughal Empire, But even then, there's this fascinating cultural fusion.
So it wasn't just one dominating the other.
No, it was this exchange, this blending. The Mughal Empire, for example, they combined Islamic and Hindu elements in art, architecture, even social customs.
Wow.
It shows how people can find that common ground, create something new and beautiful from what seems like totally different things.
It really challenges that idea of Islam and Hinduism being at odds.
It does. In fact, even the caste system, which is so deeply rooted in Hinduism, it influenced Muslim communities in India, even though there were theological objections.
So cultural reality sometimes trumps religious doctrine.
It does. It's about those daily interactions, shaping how communities relate to each other, beyond what the scriptures might say.
Right, right. But it hasn't always been peaceful, has it?
No. There's been communal violence between Hindus and Muslims,
Right.
often driven by politics, those deeper social and economic anxieties.
So not just ancient hatreds, but modern factors, political
Yes.
manipulation, power struggles.
Exactly. The U.S. Library of Congress did a study, And they concluded that a lot of that violence can be traced back to politicians using religion for votes.
Exploiting those feelings for their own gain.
It's tragic. It reminds us that religion can be a weapon used to divide people.
It's a reminder to look beyond the simple explanations, to see those power dynamics, those inequality.
Yeah, got it. And unfortunately, it's led to a situation where Muslims in India often face discrimination, even though they're a vital part of the nation.
That's a sad truth that we see in so many places.
Yeah, and that marginalization just feeds those anxieties, those narratives about Islam not belonging.
It's a vicious cycle.
It is. India is such a complex case study. We see the historical tensions, the conflicts, but also those moments of coexistence, of cultures blending. It reminds us that the human story isn't black and white. It's all these contradictions, complexities, possibilities.
Beautifully put. And those complexities continue with Islam's encounter with China, a relationship going back centuries, shaped by trade, migration, and Islam adapting to this completely different cultural context. China's always struck me as this ancient, unchangeable civilization with its own unique culture and philosophy.
Right.
How did Islam, coming from the Middle East, gain a foothold in such a different environment?
Well, like in India, there were multiple paths. Trade was a big one. Muslim merchants built communities along the Silk Road in coastal cities.
Okay.
That led to Islam spreading, especially among the Hui people.
Right.
They're ethnically Han Chinese, but they've adopted Islam.
So again, there's personal connections, cultural and commercial exchanges, not conquest.
Right. And for the Hui, it led to this unique mix of Islamic and Chinese traditions. They integrated seamlessly into Chinese society. They speak Chinese, have Chinese names, even incorporated Confucian ideas into their practice.
That's fascinating. Islam adapting, blending, not that rigid, unchangeable force we sometimes hear about.
Exactly. The Hui Muslims show how flexible Islam can be, how it can coexist with other systems. But that's not the whole story. China also has a large population of Turkic Muslims, mainly the Uyghurs in Xinjiang.
And that's where we see those familiar tensions, the anxieties about difference.
Yes. The Uyghurs, they have their own language, culture, and they're more traditional in their Islamic practice. Integrating into Chinese society has been much harder for them.
Right.
The Chinese authorities are suspicious of them. They see their separate identity as a threat to unity and stability.
It's sad, but it's something we see so often. Anyone seen as different faces the discrimination.
It's true. And the tension between the Hui and the Uyghurs shows how ethnicity matters, even within the same faith.
So not just Islam versus China, but these layers of ethnicity, culture, and power.
Exactly. And then you add the Chinese government's policies in Xinjiang, which have been criticized for suppressing Uyghur culture and religious freedom.
It's like those broader geopolitical tensions, anxieties about control. They overshadow any attempts at interfaith dialogue.
You're right. It shows that we need to address those underlying inequalities, those political and social issues, if we want a more peaceful and inclusive world.
So we've seen how Islam has interacted with all these different cultures, Byzantines, Russian Orthodox, India, China. It's always a mix of factors, right?
Yeah.
Trade, migration, conquest, colonialism. And through all of that, there's this theme of Western colonialism and its impact on the Muslim world.
A huge impact. European colonialism left a mark on the Muslim world. Politically, economically, psychologically even. Those tensions we see today, they're rooted in that history of domination, resistance, resentment.
So it's not just the historical injustice, it's the lasting psychological effect, the humiliation, the distrust.
Exactly. And colonialism wasn't just political, it was economic exploitation.
Right.
Resources extracted, traditional economies disrupted, their own systems imposed, undermining local institutions, cultural practices.
It was about reshaping those societies to benefit the colonial powers.
Yes. And that disruption hit Islamic institutions hard. They were marginalized, used for the colonial agenda. It prevented them from evolving, adapting.
And time.
Yeah. And it created this tension between those traditional forms of Islamic authority and a modernizing world. That tension is still playing out in many Muslim countries today. Questions of identity, governance, the role of Islam in the 21st century.
Colonialism wasn't just a past event, it's still shaping us.
It is. And then there's the West's continued involvement in the Muslim world, what some call neocolonialism.
Neocolonialism, what's that?
It's how Western powers, especially the U.S., still influence and control Muslim countries through economic policies, military intervention, supporting authoritarian regimes.
So a more subtle form of control.
Right. And this fuels resentment, resistance. It feeds those clash of civilizations narratives, that sense of victimhood.
Another vicious cycle, perpetuating those grievances, making it hard to build any kind of understanding.
And then add the global war on terror, which has made the West's approach to the Muslim world even more militarized.
So instead of addressing those root causes, we're using force, just creating more resentment.
Yeah, and that militarization is often justified by those simplistic ideas about Islam being violent, incompatible with the West.
It's like those clash of civilizations narratives become self-fulfilling prophecies.
They do. And it's important to remember, resisting foreign domination is a human instinct. Muslims, like anyone, will resist those who try to control them.
So it's not some Islamic drive for conflict. It's about freedom, self-determination.
Exactly. And that's where the idea of jihad gets distorted. Originally, it's a complex concept: personal striving, spiritual struggle, defending your community.
Not just holy war, like we often hear.
Right. But extremist groups have twisted it to justify violence.
It's sad how something meant for spiritual growth gets used for destruction.
It is. And we have to separate that distorted jihad from legitimate struggles for freedom, for resistance to occupation.
Context matters.
It does. And this brings us to terrorism. The 9/11 attacks, that horrific violence, it changed how the West sees Islam, fueled those anxieties about a clash of civilizations.
It became the defining moment.
It did. And it led to the war on terror, with all its consequences for both the Muslim world and the West.
Before we talk about the war on terror, let's talk about terrorism itself.
Okay.
It seems like a word that gets thrown around without a clear definition.
You're right. Defining terrorism is tricky. It's political. Governments define it to suit their needs. Their opponents are terrorists. Their own violence is legitimate.
One person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter.
Exactly. And that makes it hard to talk about. The U.S. Department of Defense, for example, defines it as the calculated use of unlawful violence or threat of unlawful violence to inculcate fear.
Unlawful violence, that's vague.
It is. Who decides what's lawful? Often, those fighting against oppression, against occupation, are labeled terrorists, even if they have legitimate grievances.
Those in power control the narrative.
Yes. And that shapes how we understand terrorism. It hides the root causes, keeps the conflict going.
We need to look deeper, beyond the labels.
We do. So how do we actually address terrorism?
Because calling people terrorists and bombing them hasn't worked.
It hasn't. In fact, the war on terror, with its focus on military solutions, its heavy hand, has probably made things worse. More resentment, more radicalization.
So what's the alternative? How do we break this cycle?
We need a change in perspective.
Okay.
We need to move away from the simple narratives, see the complexity.
To address the root causes, not just the symptoms.
Exactly. Acknowledge how Western foreign policy contributes to the problem.
Take responsibility for our actions.
Yes. Address those underlying grievances. Poverty, inequality, that feeling of humiliation.
Right.
We need diplomacy, development, dialogue. Partner with Muslim communities, Muslim governments.
It's a big task.
It is. And it means rejecting those zero-tolerance policies that lead to more violence, more alienation.
So no more simplistic slogans, a more nuanced approach.
Exactly. We need to challenge our assumptions, question the dominant narratives, and try to understand the Muslim world with empathy.
It's a lot to ask, but it might be the only way to a more peaceful future. We need to rethink how the West interacts with the Muslim world. No more military solutions, no more clash of civilizations.
We're stuck in this cycle of fear and reaction. We need to stop and think about the consequences.
So if we could hit reset, what would a better approach look like? A more ethical approach?
Well, first, we drop those simplistic ideas about Islam as one big thing bent on conflict. Remember, Islam is what Muslims think Islam is.
Right. So many variations. Just like in Christianity, to say all Christians are the same would be ridiculous.
Exactly. And it's just as ridiculous to say all Muslims support terrorism or want a global caliphate. Most just want a good life, like everyone else.
So how do we get past those stereotypes and start building bridges?
Dialogue. What if we invested in dialogue between Western and Muslim communities instead of drone strikes?
Real conversations, people sharing their experiences, their hopes.
Yes. And we need to support those moderate voices within Islam who are speaking out against extremism.
Those voices are out there.
They are scholars, activists, everyday people. They're often drowned out, but they're there. We need to help them be heard.
Okay, dialogue. But what about those underlying issues? Poverty, inequality, the lack of opportunity.
Huge factors. You can't ignore those and then act surprised when people become radicalized. Think of a young person in a refugee camp, no hope for the future, surrounded by reminders of humiliation.
It's a recipe for extremism.
It is. It's much more effective and cheaper to invest in education, healthcare, economic opportunity than to fight endless wars.
Build schools, not bombs.
Exactly. Shift our priorities.
It's a huge change, but it would be worth it to finally break that cycle of violence.
It would. And remember, peace isn't just the absence of war. It's the presence of justice. Opportunity for everyone.
And that's what this deep dive is about, isn't it? Understanding history, it's not just about the past, it's about building a better future.
Exactly. And you, the listener, you're part of that. The next time you hear someone reducing this complex situation to Islam versus the West, push back. Offer a different perspective.
Because we've seen, even without Islam, a lot of those historical problems would still be there. Blaming one religion is just too easy.
It is, and it doesn't help. We need to dig deeper, challenge our assumptions, and see the Muslim world as human beings, not just some abstract threat.
So keep questioning, keep learning, keep connecting those dots. Maybe one day we'll look back and wonder how we ever let things get so bad.
And maybe you'll be part of the solution. Using this knowledge to build bridges, that's the real power of a deep dive.
Yeah, real paradigm shift. We can't keep doing the same old thing and expect things to magically get better.
It's like, that Einstein quote, right? Insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. We need new ways of thinking, a willingness to question, what we think we know, and to really understand the Muslim world, all its nuances.
Yeah, it's about moving past those gut reactions and really thinking things through, being more compassionate, and ultimately finding approaches that actually work.
Right, finding what's effective. So let's think about what that path forward might look like.
Okay, we've talked about dropping the simplistic narratives, right?
Yeah.
Promoting dialogue. But how do we actually turn those ideas into action? Where do we go from there?
Well, first we got to acknowledge we're not dealing with one Islam.
Right.
We need to engage with all the different ways of thinking and practicing within the Muslim world. There are as many interpretations of Islam as there are of Christianity.
Right, like saying all Christians think and act the same, which is obviously not true. You've got Catholics, Protestants, evangelicals, and everything in between.
Exactly. And it's just as wrong to lump all Muslims together, to assume they all support terrorism or want some global caliphate. I mean, most Muslims, they just want peace. They want security. They want a good life for themselves and their families, just like everyone else.
So how do we get past those stereotypes? How do we actually start building those bridges?
Well, dialogue is a powerful tool. Imagine instead of just military action, we actually invested in programs that create real dialogue between the West and Muslim communities.
Like actual face-to-face conversations, right?
Yeah.
Where people can share their experiences, their fears, their hopes.
Right, exactly. Creating those spaces where people can connect, human to human, beyond all the labels and stereotypes. And it's about listening, really listening with empathy, trying to understand those different perspectives, even if we don't always agree.
It sounds so simple, but it's powerful, right? Just talking to each other, actually listening. That could do so much to break down those walls of fear and misunderstanding.
It could. And we need to make sure those conversations include diverse voices, including, moderate Muslims who are speaking out against extremism, against violence.
Because they're out there, right?
Yeah.
Muslim scholars, activists, everyday people who are working for a vision of Islam that's peaceful and tolerant.
They're definitely out there. They often get drowned out by those louder voices, the more sensationalized ones. But they're doing the work, trying to build bridges, promote understanding. We need to amplify their message, support their efforts, give them a platform.
Okay, dialogue. But we also can't forget about those bigger issues. Poverty, inequality, lack of opportunity.
You're right. Those are huge factors. You can't ignore them and then be surprised when people turn to extremism. I mean, think about a young person growing up in a refugee camp, no hope for the future, constantly seeing, the humiliation, the injustice that their people have faced.
It's a perfect breeding ground for resentment, for despair. For someone to come along and exploit that, offering violence as a solution, a false sense of purpose.
Right. And it's not just refugee camps. It's about addressing those systematic inequalities that exist all over the world, those gaps in wealth, in education, in opportunity. That's where extremism takes root.
So we're talking about investing in those long-term solutions, the things that empower people, that give them a reason to believe in peace.
Yeah, creating a more just world, a more equitable world. And let's face it, it's cheaper, way cheaper and more effective to invest in things like education, healthcare, economic opportunities than it is to just keep fighting wars forever.
So instead of bombs and drones, we're talking about building schools, building hospitals, creating
Exactly.
jobs, giving people a real chance.
Exactly. Changing our priorities, shifting away from those militarized solutions to solutions that actually address the root causes of conflict and instability.
It sounds like a huge undertaking, a total shift for Western foreign policy.
Hmm.
But, I mean, wouldn't it be worth it to finally break that cycle of violence and create a more peaceful world?
It would be. And it's not just about peace, it's about justice. Remember, true peace, it's not just the absence of war, it's the presence of justice, opportunity, dignity for everyone.
And that brings us back to the core of this whole deep dive, right?
Mhm.
Understanding history, understanding these long-standing tensions between the West and the Muslim world. It's not just about knowing facts and dates. It's about using that knowledge to create a better future. A future where those old conflicts, those narratives that divide us, they don't have power anymore.
I agree. It's about recognizing that, we're all part of this human family. We all want the same things, peace, security, a world where everyone has dignity and respect.
So for you listening, the next time you hear someone talking about the Middle East, reducing it all down to some clash of religions, remember, it's so much more complicated than that.
Yeah, it's a story that needs to be questioned. We need to challenge those simple narratives
Mm.
and engage with the Muslim world, with all cultures really, with empathy, with curiosity, with a real desire to understand.
It's about realizing that these challenges we're facing, they're complex, they're interconnected, and the solutions, they're going to require us to work together, to have compassion, to build bridges instead of walls.
Well said. And as we've seen in this deep dive, even if Islam didn't exist, a lot of those historical fault lines, the power struggles, the cultural clashes, those anxieties about the other, they'd still be there. Islam isn't the root of all global conflict. It's not about blaming anyone. It's about understanding how all these threads of history are woven together and how we can work together to create a better future.
Right, blaming one faith for all the world's problems, it's not just lazy thinking, it's actually dangerous. It ignores all the things that have shaped our history and continue to shape the world today. We have to move beyond those simple explanations if we want to make a real difference.
I couldn't agree more. It's in understanding those complexities, those nuances, that we can start to break down those harmful narratives and build a world that's more peaceful and more just.
So keep exploring, keep questioning, keep connecting the dots. It's in those moments when we're truly curious and open-minded that we discover our shared humanity and see the potential for something better.
That's the real power of a deep dive. It's not just about learning stuff. It's about using what we learn to change our perspective, broaden our understanding, and inspire us to act.
And maybe, you listening, you'll be part of that solution. Maybe you'll use this knowledge to build bridges, to challenge those stereotypes, to make the world a more peaceful, just, and equitable place.
That would be a legacy worth leaving. And so we encourage you to keep going, keep learning, keep delving into those things that sparked your curiosity, and keep having those conversations that can lead to real change.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep working towards a better world.